Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are opening up a political vault and examining the precise moment history wasn't just made, but, well, violently wrenched onto a terrifyingly new path.
You know, a good way to think about this period, the early 1940s, is like a colossal concrete dam holding back immense pressure.
Okay.
The water rising behind it, that's years of slow, crushing political buildup. You've got Franklin D. Roosevelt's increasingly fragile health, the pressure of a world war, and this quiet but just devastating internal war raging inside the Democratic
So
Party.
between the progressives and the conservatives.
Exactly. And the crack in that dam that finally bursts, flooding the world with, a half century of ideological conflict and nuclear dread.
That happened in seconds.
It happened in a matter of seconds, less than a minute, inside a sweltering, chaotic stadium in Chicago in 1944.
I think it's so important to set the stakes right at the top. This wasn't just some run-of-the-mill vice presidential nomination.
Oh, not at all. I mean, given Roosevelt's gaunt appearance, his trembling hands, all the rumors swirling through Washington, every single person in that room, every political operative and party boss, they knew what they were really doing.
They're choosing the next president.
They were choosing the next president of the United States. And that choice would define the entire post-war world order. It would decide if America sought a genuine partnership with the Soviet Union or if it would confront it head-on.
And that is our mission for you today. We are diving into what was arguably the most consequential political coup of the 20th century. And it all hinged on a single, unbelievably fragile moment at the Democratic National Convention.
We're going to explore that dramatic, almost seductive story of the voice from the sewer, that persistent political lore, and then we're going to reveal the much more subtle, but honestly much more devastating historical truth of what really stole the nomination.
Our goal here is to connect that single crucial night in Chicago directly to the entire architecture of the Cold War.
And to show you just how close we all were to living in a completely different reality.
So let's start with the central problem facing the party establishment. The incumbent vice president, Henry A. Wallace. By July of 1944, he wasn't just, popular with the base.
No, he was overwhelmingly the choice. His popularity was immense, but for the party machine, it was an existential risk.
And to really get the magnitude of this, you have to look at the numbers.
You absolutely do. A Gallup poll, taken the very day the convention began, showed that a staggering 65% of Democratic voters wanted Wallace for VP.
65%.
Oh.
I mean, that's not just support. That is a clear, undeniable mandate from the people the party is supposed to represent.
And now here's the contrast, and this is what shows the sheer inversion of democracy that was being engineered. The candidate the bosses were pushing, a pretty low-profile senator from Missouri named Harry S. Truman.
What was he polling at?
He polled at only 2%. 2% of Democratic voters nationally. So this wasn't a choice between two popular figures. This was the party establishment trying to sideline a man with massive popular backing for someone with, well, virtually none.
Which brings us to the big question. Why? Why the intense fear? What was so radical about Henry Wallace that they were willing to risk fracturing the party to stop him?
It was his ideology, 100%. And we have to understand it was revolutionary for its time. Wallace wasn't just a progressive Democrat, he was a global visionary. The core of their fear is in his most famous speech from May 8, 1942.
The Century of the Common Man speech.
That's the one. It was his manifesto, really.
So what did it actually advocate for that so terrified the conservative wing of the party?
Its ambition was just sweeping. Wallace envisioned a post-war world based on 4 principles that were complete anathema to the old guard. First, robust international cooperation, basically turning the wartime alliance with the Soviets into a permanent partnership for peace and economic development.
A partnership, not a competition. That is a fundamentally different starting point for foreign policy.
Completely different. Second, he argued for racial equality and an end to colonialism worldwide. That immediately alienated the entire bloc of powerful, conservative Southern Democrats who, enforced segregation and controlled huge parts of the party machine.
Of course.
Third, he talked about economic democracy, a system where cartels and monopolies would be dismantled globally to ensure shared prosperity. And finally, and this was the big one,
Trust in the Soviet Union.
trust, viewing them as a partner who also wanted peace after facing the absolute brunt of Hitler's army.
So, okay, if you're a conservative Southern Democrat worried about segregation, or a city machine boss profiting from the corporate structure, or just a hawk who distrusts communism, Wallace is an existential threat on every single front.
He was. They saw him as this naive mystic, totally disconnected from geopolitical reality. And their fear was specific. If Roosevelt dies and President Wallace takes over, his pro-Soviet leanings would be exploited by Stalin.
They were worried he'd share atomic secrets.
That was a huge fear. The Manhattan Project was nearing completion. They thought he'd share the bomb or make crippling concessions that would hand the post-war world to the USSR. In their minds, they were saving the country from a catastrophic loss of the peace.
So the fight wasn't about electability at all because he was clearly popular. It was purely ideological.
It was about the fundamental direction of the country for the next 50 years. This was realpolitik meeting radical idealism head on.
And to pull off this inversion of the popular will, they needed masters of the party machine.
The generals of the operation, yes.
Who were they?
The general leading the charge was Robert E. Hannigan. He was the chairman of the Democratic National Committee. Hannigan controlled the schedule, the platform, the official message. He was the field commander.
And the strategist, the money man.
That was Edwin W. Pauley, the treasurer of the DNC.
And as treasurer, he controlled the flow of money, which is the lifeblood of any state party organization. That gives you immense, quiet leverage.
That's it, exactly. Hannigan controlled the gavel. Pauley controlled the financial spigot. They were a formidable, coordinated force. And they understood that to defeat a wave of genuine popular enthusiasm like Wallace's, you couldn't use arguments. You had to use power.
So the architects had their reasons, they had their tools, but they knew that to run a successful coup against a sitting vice president, you have to neutralize the one person with absolute authority.
FDR himself.
Exactly.
And this brings us to that pivotal White House meeting on July 11th, 1944. Hannigan, Pauley, and the others, they had to perform this difficult political surgery. They had to convince Roosevelt, who had personally picked Wallace, to now reject him.
And how did they approach that? What was the angle they used?
Party unity, first and foremost. They argued that Wallace was a political liability, that he'd alienate the vital conservative Southern bloc and potentially cost Roosevelt the election against Dewey. But the real argument, the one that carried all the weight, was the simple, terrifying fact of FDR's health.
The thing nobody wanted to say out loud was now the main talking point.
It was the entire talking point. They stressed that this VP choice was, in all likelihood, choosing the next president, this manufactured sense of urgency. It was essential. And Roosevelt, who was weary, visibly ill, he finally reluctantly agreed. Wallace had to go.
But even then, it seems like the dying king, as you put it, was still leaning left. He didn't just rubber stamp their choice.
He absolutely did not. When Hannigan pressed him for alternatives, Roosevelt offered two names, Harry S. Truman, sure, but also, crucially, William O. Douglas.
A Supreme Court justice.
A dedicated New Dealer who shared a lot of Wallace's progressive ideology. It really seems like Roosevelt wanted to replace Wallace with another progressive, just maybe a less controversial one.
And this is where Hannigan and Pauley showed their political genius or their ruthlessness. They had to take FDR's vague concession and spin it into a public endorsement for their guy, for Truman.
And erase Douglas from the equation entirely.
Right.
The ambiguity of FDR became their perfect weapon, and this all comes down to a single document, a letter dated July 19th, 1944.
The famous letter.
The letter sent to Hannigan, where Roosevelt says he'd be happy to run with either Truman or Douglas, believing either would bring real strength to the ticket.
Happy to run with. I mean, that sounds like a president grudgingly signing off on two compromises, not passionately anointing a successor.
It's the definition of a weak endorsement. But Hannigan and Pauley treated it like an ironclad mandate for Truman. They paraded this letter around as definitive proof that Truman was Roosevelt's choice.
And here's the dark art of the whole thing.
The dark art is that they immediately suppressed the name of Douglas. And they certainly didn't breathe a word about the other letter Roosevelt had written.
The private one.
The private one, where he said that if he were a delegate, he would personally vote for Henry Wallace.
So they leveraged the president's declining health against his own political heart. They took one half of a reluctant endorsement, hid the other half, and weaponized it.
It was a classic bait and switch. And the reason they chose Truman over the other progressive option, Douglas, was obvious. Truman was the absolute antithesis of Wallace.
Wallace the idealist, Truman the pragmatist.
Wallace the radical, Truman the manageable machine politician. He had solid Senate credentials, but his low national profile, that 2% polling number, that was actually an asset to them.
He was a blank slate, controllable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They wanted a steady hand who would respect the consensus, not a visionary who would tear down the whole structure and, risk cozying up to Stalin. Truman was the perfect choice because he posed the least risk to their power.
But all the maneuvering in the White House, all the planning in the hotel suites, it had one massive, unpredictable flaw.
The actual people, the delegates gathered in Chicago. And when that convention opened, the boss's carefully laid plans just about went up in smoke.
The atmosphere on the evening of Thursday, July 20th, inside Chicago Stadium, it must have been just electric.
It was electric, oppressively hot, and incredibly tense. The delegates were not following the script that Hannigan had written.
So paint the scene for us. What happens when Henry Wallace steps onto the stage?
The stadium just erupts. And this wasn't some pre-planned, organized demonstration with signs and paid marchers. This was a massive, spontaneous, roaring wave of grassroots political passion.
How long did it last?
A full 15 minutes. The delegates broke ranks, chanting, "We want Wallace." It was a genuine tidal wave, and you can imagine the bosses watching from the platform. They were in a full-blown panic.
Sources describe it as a wildfire that was just minutes away from consuming their whole plan, and one man saw the moment and tried to seize it.
Florida Senator Claude Pepper, a staunch Wallace supporter, he starts fighting his way through the chaos, pushing toward the microphone.
His goal was strategic.
Absolutely. He wanted to capitalize on that fever pitch, place Wallace's name into nomination right then and there, and force an immediate vote. If he had done that with that energy in the room, Wallace would have won.
And the first ballot proved just how close they were, didn't it?
It did. They hastily conducted a first ballot amidst all the roaring, and Wallace was in the lead. He had 429.5 votes to Truman's 319.5.
But not enough for the majority.
Right. He was short of the 589 he needed, but the momentum was undeniably his. The floor was swinging hard. If a second ballot had been held immediately, Wallace would have been the nominee.
Okay, so let's pivot now, because this is where the dramatic lore meets the devastating historical reality. The popular story, the one most people think they know, is the voice from the sewer.
Yes. The almost cinematic moment of audio sabotage that killed the momentum.
That's a great story.
It's the perfect movie moment, and it's pervasive political lore. The story goes that a hidden microphone, sometimes called the voice from the sewer, was switched on, and it boomed out this artificial fake chant for Truman.
Drowning out the real "We want Wallace" chant.
Exactly, creating just enough confusion and chaos to stop the process. And it sounds so good because it encapsulates the idea of a cheap trick overwhelming the will of the people.
But it's not what happened.
It's not what happened that night. And this is the historical correction we have to make really clear for you. The concept is real. A secret microphone was used by Chicago's superintendent of sewers to push FDR for a third term back at the 1940 DNC. But the event that stopped Wallace in 1944 was not the microphone, it was the gavel.
So if it wasn't a hidden mic, what was the real move that silenced everyone?
The real coup was subtle, procedural, and entirely non-democratic. It was the deliberate, fraudulent adjournment called by the convention chairman, Samuel D. Jackson.
How did you do it?
As the Wallace demonstration reached its absolute peak, Jackson called for a simple voice vote on adjournment, a motion to just end the night's proceedings.
So the delegates had to shout "aye" to go home or "nay" to keep voting.
And according to every reliable eyewitness account, the crowd delivered a thunderous NN.
Wanted to vote.
They were not ready to go home. They wanted the vote to happen now. But Jackson, with the bosses looking on, he ignored the sound, slammed his gavel down, and declared loudly that the ayes had it. Session adjourned.
He just lied. He lied about the result of a voice vote, using the power of his position to literally halt democracy.
It was pure, raw procedural sabotage, and Chairman Jackson later openly admitted it. He said he had received strict instructions from Hannigan not to let the convention nominate the vice president that night.
So the machine couldn't beat the enthusiasm, so they just stopped the clock.
That single fraudulent bang of a gavel was the difference. The wildfire was starved of air, and Senator Pepper was stopped, frozen, just feet from the podium, his voice silenced not by a Democratic vote, but by a lie and a hammer.
That forced adjournment was everything for the machine. The gavel bought them time, moving the war from the public, chaotic floor into the private, methodical coercion of the hotel suites.
And that period, from the late hours of July 20th through the early morning of the 21st, that was the longest, most consequential night of political manipulation in modern American history. Hannigan and Pauley were in their element. This is where real power operates.
I think we need to go into the specific mechanics here. It wasn't just asking nicely. What were the specific tactics they used to systematically flip delegates who had just been roaring for Wallace?
It was a targeted campaign of relentless, brutal coercion. They identified the wavering state delegations or the ones where the votes were controlled by just one or two key leaders.
And those leaders were summoned.
They were summoned to the suites of Hannigan and Pauley or to the rooms of powerful senators.
And what did Pauley, as the treasurer, bring to the table? What was his leverage?
Money and career security. The tools were very concrete. First, promises of lucrative federal jobs, ambassadorships, judgeships, key roles in the administration, all for delegates or their patrons if they delivered their votes for Truman.
And the stick to go with that carrot.
The threats of financial ruin. They threatened to withhold crucial party funds from state organizations that depended on DNC money to survive. Imagine being a state party chairman and being told, vote Wallace, and your entire state apparatus collapses next year.
That turns an ideological vote into a question of professional life and death. Wow. The machine was leveraging its own existence against the conscience of the delegate.
Exactly. And the rhetorical pressure was just as intense. They constantly repeated their patriotic duty. They used that ambiguous letter from Roosevelt to state, flatly, that Truman was the president's choice. They played on the fear of FDR's death, saying a vote for Wallace, the naive mystic, was a vote to put America at risk.
So they're framing the choice not as a political preference, but as an act of national security.
It was manipulation dressed up as sobriety. Robert Farrell's research in his book, Choosing Truman, meticulously documents this whole period, and he calls it a veritable conspiracy. Delegates faced an impossible choice: their belief in Wallace or the complete destruction of their political careers.
And when you apply that much pressure all night long, the will eventually breaks.
State by state, it broke.
What about Truman's role in all this? Was he in the rooms twisting arms?
Yeah. No, and that was crucial to the success of the whole thing. Truman maintained the image of the reluctant patriot. You know, the humble public servant who just wanted to serve. He was largely absent from the carnage, which was strategic genius.
His absence let the bosses maintain the narrative.
It did. It let Hannigan and Pauley frame the whole operation not as a backroom fix, but as this necessary, sober choice being made by responsible patriots. They contrasted Truman's reliability with Wallace's supposed volatile, radical idealism.
So while Wallace's supporters were sleeping, thinking their voice would be heard in the morning,
the machine was systematically dismantling their entire support structure, delegate by delegate. By dawn, the work was done.
And when the convention came back for the second ballot, the numbers showed just how brutally efficient they were.
The change was devastating. Remember, Wallace led on the first ballot with over 429 votes. When the final tally came on the second ballot, Harry Truman won the nomination with a crushing 1,031 votes.
On Wallace.
Henry Wallace finished with a mere 105. The political reality was just violently inverted in the space of one coerced, desperate night. The choice of 65% of the Democratic base was overridden by the will of a few powerful men.
The machine won. Their man, Harry Truman, was installed as vice president on January 20, 1945. And the consequences, the very thing they based their entire coup on, arrived with just brutal, unforgiving speed.
Truman served only 82 days as vice president.
82 days.
Less than 3 months. On April 12, 1945, Franklin D. Roosevelt died. And the man favored by just 2% of Democratic voters, the manageable party man chosen in a back room, was suddenly the most powerful person on earth.
And that transition, enabled by that stolen nomination, it instantly triggered a global pivot. It fundamentally changed the trajectory of the entire post-war world. Let's trace those direct consequences.
The first, most profound change was the dawn of the atomic age. Truman inherited the secret Manhattan Project, and within months faced the decision to use the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A monumental decision, not just militarily, but geopolitically.
And how does that decision contrast with what President Wallace might have done?
Given Wallace's deeply cooperative worldview, historians widely speculate he would have handled the atomic monopoly completely differently. He likely would have seen the bomb as a tool for international bargaining, or maybe even placed it under the control of the new United Nations.
In line with his vision of shared interests.
Right. But Truman used it immediately and decisively. And you have to understand, it wasn't just to end the war. It was also to assert immediate, overwhelming American global dominance against the growing influence of the Soviet Union.
So the bomb was used as much to send a message to Moscow as it was to defeat Japan.
Exactly. It was a move that solidified a confrontational tone, which was fully realized just a few months later at the Potsdam Conference, Truman's first big meeting with Joseph Stalin.
Had Wallace been there, the tone would have been about collaboration.
It would have been.
Well,
Instead, Truman met Stalin not as a potential partner, but immediately as a rival to be confronted. His plain-spoken, hardline stance set the tone. There was no grand alliance for peace. Instead, the lines were drawn, spheres of influence were carved out, and suspicion became the bedrock of diplomacy.
and this rapid shift from alliance to confrontation led directly to the foundational pillars of the Cold War.
It gave us the entire architecture of opposition that lasted half a century. You see it first in the Truman Doctrine in 1947,
Pledging support to free peoples resisting subjugation.
which was, effectively, a global ideological declaration of war against the spread of communism. It committed the U.S. to intervention all over the world.
And then came the Marshall Plan.
The massive strategic economic counterforce. While it was framed as generosity, the Marshall Plan was a calculated strategic bulwark. It rebuilt Western Europe and created an economic moat against Soviet expansion. And that policy firmly entrenched the division of the world into two opposing antagonistic blocs.
It is genuinely chilling to trace this entire chain.
Right.
The half-century of proxy wars, the arms race, the nuclear dread. It was all a direct, measurable consequence of the man installed during that stolen nomination.
The entire post-1945 geopolitical reality, the world you and I grew up in, it stems from this one fragile moment. A lie told with a gavel bought them one night. That night secured a nomination. That nomination led to a presidency 82 days later. And that presidency made the choices that defined the next 50 years of human existence.
Which forces us to confront the great counterfactual, the great what if. What if that gavel had gone the other way? What if Claude Pepper had reached that podium and Wallace had been nominated?
In that alternate history, President Henry A. Wallace is inaugurated in April 1945. His administration would have been governed entirely by his century of the common man ideals. He would have sought genuine global partnership, even with the Soviet Union.
So the idealist vision, the one the bosses feared most, is that the Cold War could have been entirely averted. Let's explore that potential outcome first.
That's the ideal scenario. The diplomatic landscape shifts from confrontation to partnership. The Cold War, as we know it, is averted or severely minimized. Maybe Wallace tries to share technology, including the atomic blueprint, to ensure international control and prevent an arms race.
Trillions of dollars, millions of lives saved from proxy conflicts in Korea, Vietnam.
And maybe the United Nations matures into a powerful, cooperative global governing body. It's a stunning thought. A world without that half-century of nuclear anxiety.
But then there's the nightmare scenario.
Yeah.
The one Hannigan and Pauley genuinely believed they were preventing.
And we have to acknowledge this as a serious potential outcome. In this version, Wallace's idealism is seen not as peace, but as weakness by Joseph Stalin. An emboldened Soviet Union, facing no credible hardline opposition, exploits that soft stance and dominates the post-war landscape, expanding its influence far beyond historical reality.
So in that scenario, the confrontational stability that Truman built might have been replaced by a period of unchecked Soviet expansionism.
That's the central tension. The bosses believed their ruthless procedural sabotage was, paradoxically, an act of global safety. They chose the world of confrontation because they believed the alternative, the ghost of cooperation embodied by Wallace, was just too dangerous, too naive.
But regardless of which what-if path you find more plausible, the essential point remains the same. The almost absurd fragility of history itself.
That is the chilling insight. The entire world structure we inherited, our alliances, our economic systems, the military-industrial complex, it was not inevitable destiny. It was the direct result of a few desperate men, a procedural maneuver, and a lie told with a gavel that halted the people's will.
History turned on 30 seconds and one vote that night.
It did. Every major geopolitical event of the latter half of the 20th century was constructed in part on that moment of engineered chaos in 1944. The ghost of cooperation is the alternative reality that was just moments away from existing.
To summarize this deep dive, then, the story of the stolen nomination is often simplified into this dramatic lore of a rigged microphone, the voice from the sewer.
But the real historical coup was far more political, far more procedural, and ultimately far more profound. It was the brutal, successful sabotage of a powerful party machine.
And what stands out most compellingly is the fundamental nature of political power. The outcome of that convention demonstrated in stark relief that the application of power, The backroom deals, the financial leverage, the procedural fraud will often override overwhelming, genuine popular sentiment.
65% of Democratic voters wanted Wallace, but the machine chose the 2% man. The political will was calculatedly and efficiently inverted.
And the consequences are inescapable. The political static of that night in Chicago still crackles beneath our current reality. The entire architecture of global ideological opposition, the structure of NATO, the decisions around nuclear weapons, they all stem from that one stolen night.
We are, for better or worse, living in the world that Truman made. And if the establishment of the Cold War, a half-century of global struggle hinged on a desperate overnight political operation and a lie told with a gavel, it raises an incredibly important question for you, the listener.
What invisible hinges is our world turning on right now? What popular will is being suppressed? What forces are being manipulated? And what invisible maneuvers are taking place in the smoky back rooms we can't see that will define the next 50 years?
That's the true power of history. The echoes of all the worlds that almost were remind us that the present is far more fragile than we often assume.
Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.